welcome to Reimagine 2020. I'm one of your hosts, Artur, and today I have with me Loong from Ren Protocol, a decentralized liquidity protocol, and I guess most known for the bringing truly trustless Bitcoin to Ethereum. Welcome, Loong. Great to have you back.
Hey, thanks for having me back.
So I guess so we last spoke about a month ago, and this was when the sort of I guess DeFi summer was kind of at its peak. Now things have kind of calmed down a little bit. What are your thoughts? How do you feel now? And sort of what were the kind of, I guess, learning points?
I'm glad that things have calmed down a little bit. Generally, I think a lot of people learned not to put their assets into completely wild and untested and unaudited contracts by people that were unknown. I think I'm glad it didn't last much longer. I think we kind of got away relatively unscathed. There weren't too many, big bad events that happened. So I think that's good. I think it created a really interesting discourse around, the responsibility of developers and what is their role when experimenting and disclosing. It's hard to experiment without people, but how do you get people on board in something that is fundamentally an experiment? So a lot of interesting questions that I think are still unanswered and probably will only be answered through sort of general community consensus over the years.
And so definitely from you, I can definitely hear the kind of the negative learning points. Anything positive that you feel came sort of out of all this as well?
I think we saw some interesting uses for governance. I think that was the primary mechanism through which a lot of this farming happened was that you create a protocol and you'd create some token that was around governance and you'd get APY essentially in that token. So I think there were some interesting lessons learned around how do you get a community on board with governance? How do you incentivize them to govern? What kind of emission curves are people comfortable with or uncomfortable with? And I think that's a huge positive. It certainly helped the Ren team further our own thinking around how we want to do on-chain governance in the future.
Got it. And I guess it must be sort of like a sigh of relief for you generally being like a DeFi builder that finally you can kind of get back to work again and don't have to sort of deal with all these sort of non-stop kind of mania.
Yeah, it's hard to sometimes it can be hard to concentrate or convince yourself and the community that you're doing the right thing when there's some project over there getting 1000% APY, which is clearly ridiculous and not actually a real APY measurement, and it settles down to something sane pretty quickly. But yeah.
But was there any kind of did you guys have any serious discussions on your side or serious considerations whether to kind of to move towards like an emission type of token model? Because Ren, you don't have essentially any form of sort of liquidity mining or incentivization, right?
Yeah, we have actually considered that in the past, but I think it's been pretty much a non-starter, and this DeFi yielding stuff didn't really create a new discussion around that for us. I think the thing we're most interested in, I think the thing that interests me personally the most about an inflationary model for a token is the ability to incentivize governance through disincentivizing free riding. People who are participating in governance, you can kind of inflate the governance token and give them a little bit more of it. I really don't like the idea of using governance tokens as a way to incentivize participation in the protocol at other levels. So it doesn't make sense, for example, for Ren VM to give out Ren tokens to use BTC on Ethereum, or to take BTC off Ethereum, because the idea is that you want to service a natural demand in the ecosystem for this product. And if there isn't a natural demand, there's no point trying to synthesize one by generating tokens out of nowhere.
Yeah, I guess with that example, you would be kind of incentivizing people to come into and go out of your store, and you'd end up with a lot of people going through your store, but no one would still be technically buying anything, right?
Yeah, or you're not necessarily capturing on a real market demand for Bitcoin on Ethereum. Yeah.
Okay. Exciting. Well, I mean, like, it's always great to see sort of, projects with a kind of very, cool head that are able to kind of navigate in the long run. In the meanwhile, since we last spoke, you guys also announced or that you will be the main bridge for Filecoin's Filecoin sort of bridge for Filecoin into the DeFi ecosystem. Can you tell me a little bit more about sort of what is this partnership? What does this mean, and how did they come to be?
Yeah, sure. Well, what happened was one of the projects helping push Filecoin forward, and some of the developers on that reached out to us to see whether RenVM was a suitable solution for getting Phil, which is the native Filecoin token, onto Ethereum, so that they can sort of get it into the DeFi ecosystem, which is sort of a very obvious natural desire for a new project to have their token in that ecosystem. So we went through it together and sort of mapped out what it might look like. It turns out, that's completely possible and completely doable. And so we spent the next several weeks working on it together. Obviously, the Ren team had no prior experience with Filecoin. So the Filecoin team helped us integrate into what we call the multi-chain, which is the sort of new API that we've created, which is a sort of a unified API for all chains. And that makes integration on our end so much easier because essentially RenVM talks to the multi-chain, and then every single project can individually use their expertise to plug into the multi-chain. So for their part, they did that work, and then we set up the infrastructure within RenVM. And right now it's live on a staging environment for testnet, and we're about to put it onto a staging environment for mainnet. So I expect that in the next week or two, we'll see Ren Phil on Ethereum mainnet.
Nice, exciting. And my next question was going to be around sort of around integrators in general. So till date, there's been three integrators with considerable volume on Ren. Are there plans to sort of, do you have plans to, for example, introduce either new integrators or, for example, Kyber Network is one which has this sort of, they pretty successfully implemented a model whereby the platform actually shares fees with the revenue generators or the integrators themselves. So kind of like two questions there, but do you guys have any sort of vision in that direction?
Yeah, I mean, we have explored various fee sharing models. Nothing that we've proposed formally because we haven't come up with a model that we like. But I think governance, decentralized governance, has to make its way into the protocol before it would make sense to do something like fee sharing, because it's even in the Kyber case, it's tightly integrated into the governance system. But yeah, we are working on getting new integrators on board. We should have a few going live this year. And we have, there was actually a mystery contract, which we're trying to figure out who it is that's been putting through several $1 million to this one address. And we have no idea. We think it's an arbitrager, but we actually don't know. So it's interesting also seeing adoption on platforms that actually are happening without the team being involved. And I think that's actually the thing I'm most excited for is watching teams naturally pick this up and get going with it. And I know that Filecoin has a bunch of DeFi integrations up their sleeve that they're wanting to go live with once Renfill is available.
That's super exciting. I guess in some ways it's kind of the protocol entering the next stage, right? Where it's no longer that you need to kind of like push every sort of like initiative yourself, but it kind of starts. This sort of like virtuous cycle actually starts to happen. Yeah, it's because I guess like one of the sort of like the angles for this like fee sharing, what we were just discussing within the team, is that like a potential sort of like use case that we saw was that, and I'm not sure, tell me if it would be possible or not, is for example for DEX aggregators and these various like DeFi smart wallets could actually then provide the BTC gateway for their users if they had some sort of like essentially some sort of guarantee of a share of the fees. Is this something that kind of makes sense, or?
It can and it cannot. It really depends. So interestingly enough, that's something that's already possible today. So because when Ren BTC gets minted, typically what an integrator will do is it'll route all minting through sort of a front contract that that they have.
Mm-hmm.
And you can implement a fee for yourself on that front contract. So at this point, the RenVM fee has already been paid for and accounted for, and you could just institute another 5 bips, 10 bips, whatever you want on top of that for the service that you're providing, whatever that service might be. So the broader question is, that's obviously you taking an extra fee for Bitcoin that routes through your system specifically. But then there's a broader question of, does it make sense to say that everyone can have a share of some broader global pool? Maybe RenVM takes 10% of all fees that it generates and it puts it into an incentive program and integrators based on adhering to some need that RenVM has, whether that's encouraging minting or encouraging burning through whatever the system is, get access to a share of those fees. The challenge here is that this is such we want to keep RenVM governance minimized if possible. And that's such an open-ended, it's almost like a DAO-based grant program. And that just gets very difficult to design in a way that's going to be safe and design in a way that's going to be well incentivized for RenVM to govern correctly and have other integrators be able to partake in that governance as well. So in principle, it can be done, but it's a challenge, mostly a community-centric challenge.
And so you mentioned governance, and that kind of that you guys still need to kind of transition over into a sort of more decentralized form of governance. What does that kind of process look like, and where do you see yourselves now in this?
So we've taken the first step. We have an open forum that anyone can participate in, where you can propose what's called an RFC, which is a request for comments. And that allows people to say, I've got this idea for how I think RenVM should change. They can post that idea in a sort of half-baked form or even fully baked, and just get feedback and iterate on it and modify it and change it and grow the idea. And then you can take that idea once it sort of generally has been converged upon and propose it formally as an RIP, or as a RIP, as we call it. And you can take this RIP, and then people get to sort of signal their approval for it on the forum. Now that process is still it's very formal, but it's not enshrined on chain. So there's not like a proper voting system where you take Ren tokens and you do all this kind of stuff. Because before we go that route, we want to see how the forum works and how fast can it move, and how much participation are we getting. And it's been really great. We've seen tons of RFCs and even some RIPs being opened by the community. We passed our first RIP, I think maybe a week ago now, which increased the minting fee from 10 bips to 20 bips. So far that's going well. And if it continues to go well, then we'll start thinking about what does a formalized on-chain voting system look like to approve RIPs versus just having it be something that's on a off-chain forum.
Got it. And I guess this is this is sort of a part about the bigger part of the bigger picture, sort of your I think you called it the road to decentralization, right? Which you've mapped out publicly as well. So I have two questions around that, which I sort of keep seeing mainly on Twitter, the sort of the kind of how to say the critique towards the only thing that people seem to be able to sort of criticize Ren about is the existence of gray core. And so my question would, which is, we've discussed this previously as well, that that you've always kind of communicated its existence, transparently, and that it serves a purpose right now. There isn't an intention to keep it permanently there, but when do you guys expect to kind of to expand gray core outside the current Ren team, or is there even such a plan?
There is such a plan, and the way the development is going, we're confident that we can start that expansion this year. It's going to take some time to happen, obviously, and we'll take it slow and keep doing it piece by piece. We're in no rush to get there, but we do hope to start that expansion this year. And this would be slowly bringing in new members one by one. And then as that goes well, we bring in new members, because the more members you get, the harder it is to coordinate change or fixes that might be required. So we want to take it sort of stage by stage in case something does go wrong. And then once we get to that stage, we want to allow people to vote on who the members of the Grey Core actually are, by essentially putting their Ren up and saying, I put my Ren behind this identity because I think it's a good identity or a reputable identity. So that might be a member of the Ren team, or it might be For example, there are members of the Zcash community that are interested in participating as well. There's groups like Polychain, Infinite Capital. There's groups like Curve as well, which is also really important because Curve clearly has a strong incentive to behave because their system uses RenBTC quite extensively. And this is really the point of the Grey Core. It's to capture this value that you can't maybe formally capture in another way, where you can look at Curve participating in governance and say, well, if you wanted to bribe Curve to misbehave, you would have to bribe them the value of their whole ecosystem, which is quite a hard thing to do. And then, if you take that and then you also say, you got to do the same to Infinite Capital and all of it, I think about all of the portfolio companies that it owns, or not owns, but has a stake in that use RenBTC as well, you start sort of seeing this broader ecosystem protection.
Got it. And has there till date been like an event or a case where you've sort of thought that, like, okay, thank God we have the Grey Core, where it's sort of like really come into action, that's something that has failed and has sort of that has come into use?
Yeah, there have been a few cases. So most of them have been user error, and they were quite frequent at the beginning, and they're getting much less frequent now. But we still had one, I think, maybe 2 weeks ago, where users do something silly. I think this particular case that we had, someone's transaction was taking a little bit longer than expected, and they wanted to refresh the gas price that they were using, and through that process, accidentally deleted their wallet, and so couldn't get access to it anymore. And so they had several BTC sort of waiting to be minted, but they deleted the wallet that had the authority to do the minting. And we were able to then step in and recover those funds for them, which is not something you could do in a decentralized system. And we learn everything. We learn something every time this happens. We can say, well, what was the UX that this person went through that caused them to incur that loss or caused them to make that mistake? And how can we either make slight modifications to the protocol to make sure that can't happen, or make modifications to our set of best practices that we encourage developers to use to sort of help minimize the likelihood that something like this will happen. We have had some technical issues, nothing that has caused the system to go offline, but things that have been totally worth seeing happen and either just observing that the system does in fact work under these circumstances, or actually fixing actively. So one of them was a Zcash upgrade, Heartwood, which was the most recent Zcash upgrade on mainnet, caused a few of our nodes to hiccup in their upgrade. The nodes sort of essentially got confused about what they should be doing during this fork. And enough of the nodes were okay that everything carried on fine. But it was important that we were able to fix that bug and reset those nodes and get them back to a stable state. And if that had happened at larger scale, it may have been more of a problem. And more recently, the Sao Paulo data center in AWS went offline for several hours worldwide. And one of our nodes happens to be in that data center. And so obviously it was disconnected from the rest of the network, but and everything was fine. And everything operated as expected. And eventually when it came back online, it picked back up and resynchronized, and there was no intervention required. But what's really important is that we were able to observe that that was the case. Because if something had gone wrong, then, it would have been hard to recover. And in this case, luckily nothing did go wrong, but that adds to our confidence that we're, able to sort of expand. Because at the end of the day, you can run all the tests you like, but you can't mimic the AWS data center going down. As much as I would love to call my mate Bezos and say, hey, can you just shut this data center down for a test that we're doing? It just doesn't happen like that. So time is really the only thing that you have to test these scenarios.
Absolutely. I think it's like when there was some military general who said that no battle plan has ever withstood facing the enemy.
That's it. That's a good one.
And so I'm a bit confused. I hear two things: that there's plan to kind of to sort of kind of like legitimize or like diversify the Grey Core, but at the same time there's like a long-term plan to actually like do away with it. So which one is it, or is it kind of sort of like a phased approach between both, or?
It's kind of both. So the point that you have governance where you can vote which members you want, governance will also have the capability not only to vote to add members, but vote to remove members. and you can just go ahead and just vote to remove every single member, and you're left with no gray core. So once governance steps in that can control who the membership is, it has the capability to remove it if it sees fit, by just essentially voting each member out. It's kind of the equivalent of, it maybe doesn't seem natural to think about, because most voting systems that people are used to is where you vote between one party or another. We're kind of saying, well, there's actually three options. You can vote for this guy, you can vote for that guy, you can vote for nobody. You just vote the government out of existence, and vote for total anarchy, which is essentially our equivalent, obviously, except it's not total anarchy because there'd be other nodes running and still maintaining the network alongside them.
Got it. And okay, thanks so much for actually clarifying that. And so another kind of, I guess, sort of criticism, or sort of like, I think the thing that confuses a lot of people is the relationship between like the value bonded and value locked, and how that's kind of going to play a part over time. So at the moment, this criteria is not followed, right, due to the existence of the gray core. So, and I know like some people have been kind of confused by this, that, you know, you like on the front end, you still, or like when I look at the network stats, then it seems that, you know, you have like so much locked and so much bonded, and it kind of, and I've seen like some people have sort of, it's thrown like a red flag. They're like, oh, like, you know, what's going on? Whereas like in reality, it actually, I understand it doesn't, that relationship isn't that super critical right now.
Yeah. So this is a really complicated topic, and a really juicy one. So the idea behind total value locked versus total value bonded is that if in the case of an attack, something goes wrong, you're able to take the total value bonded and use that to restore the peg. So if in the event of an attack, everything in RenVM gets lost and $330 million is stolen, there's only $45 million that could be used to reclaim or restore the peg, which basically means people lose 90%, 85% of their value, which is obviously a huge loss to be incurred. However, that first requires the creation of a successful attack against the system. Right now, an estimate to buy a 51% attack hashing power against Bitcoin itself is somewhere on the order of about $1 million. To do the equivalent attack on RenVM with the 45 million that's staked right now, you would need to bond something like $20 million. Now, if you were to do a 51% attack against Bitcoin, and then let's say also do a 51% attack against Ethereum, there are certain attacks that you can construct that would mean that even in the presence of total value bonded in pretty much any system that you might care to design, including some of the other systems that are out there today, this vulnerability still exists, because you can essentially just change what's happening on these chains. All of these protocols typically have some kind of timing effect where they say, well, we give some amount of time for a proof to be proposed that says, hey, this attack has happened and we need to slash bonds or what have you. You just 51% attack and censor for that period of time, and then avoid all collateral slashing. And so it starts, it's not just as simple as saying, well, if you have the bond, then everything is safe. That's not actually the case all the time. Especially in the case of high market volatility scenarios where you might see a Black Thursday type event where you see this big crash in the price of an asset, and suddenly, even though you might have had a high TVB before, now you have a low TVB. So what's important is that the security of RenVM is highly, its ability to resist attack is not dependent on the total value locked to total value bonded ratio. Its security to recover from an attack with minimized losses is what's dependent on that. So in our sense, we consider this a soft target. The closer we are to that target, the better, because if an attack does happen, we can recover from it. But what's more important in my eyes is to just not be attacked in the first place. And having to have a $20 million initial capital investment to attack a system is actually quite a huge ask, even today.
I see. Okay, and so I understand that it's essentially, it's like this kind of like an economic solution to this problem. Is there is there any like potential plans for like any research to kind of find like a technical solution to this problem? To sort of, or I guess is the technical solution to that you essentially kind of bolt it down harder that it can't get attacked in the first place? Or because I was just the way I was viewing it is that you kind of have two ways to approach it, right?
Yeah, so you're right. There are essentially those two ways. There's a how can we get close How do we resolve TBV versus TVL? And that's something that we're actively researching. And how do you make it such that an attack is almost impossible to happen in the first place, which is something we're also researching. So on the latter, one thing that we're researching there, which I find particularly interesting, is there's a new open source project called Silo, which is essentially a trusted execution environment where you can say that you guarantee a certain type of code is running, and you guarantee that it's executing correctly, and you guarantee that even the person running the code doesn't have access to it. Now that's a really cool guarantee to make, because it means that even if you wanted to behave maliciously as a node, if you're running within this silo environment, you can't. Even if you wanted to attack, you just don't have access to it. Much like it's similar to say that if someone had access to your physical ledger, they still can't force a signature to happen. They need to know the PIN, even though somewhere in this physical hardware is this private key of yours. It's just inaccessible to everyone, including you. And that makes it like incredibly hard to attack, because you would not only need to own something like 2/3 of the network, you would also have to wait or explicitly research an vulnerability within the other project and know that you were likely to find that vulnerability before the open research community and have it patched before you found it. So this makes the attack scenario just orders of magnitude harder. On the other side, we're looking at different economic models to help close the gap between TBB and TVL. So one of the things that we've recently done, as I mentioned before, is we raised the minting fee, and we're going to continue doing this and just see how the system behaves at different levels to see whether this slows down minting as we expect it should. And so far, it does look like that has worked. Then the second side is to see, can we lower burning to incentivize burning? And can we even make it negative? So you actually provide a rebate. So some of the fees that RenVM accrues, can you pay them back to people and say, well, can you get this Bitcoin out of the system now, please? And I'll give you some of the fees that we've accrued in the meantime. And then looking even further out, there is even the possibility of instituting a time-based fee. So for every year that you're holding a Bitcoin, you pay 3% of the Bitcoin's value to the network. And this has a simultaneous effect of encouraging people not to keep their Bitcoin on Ethereum for too long, but also significantly boosting the income that the nodes take. And if something goes crazy and at some point the system has 1,000 times the amount of bond as value locked, RenVM can react very harshly to that and say, well, you know what, guys, we're going to put a 50% per annum fee on this thing. Get your Bitcoin out of the system. And obviously no one's going to be paying 50% per annum, so they're going to quickly exit that Bitcoin and bring total value locked back down to total value bonded. That's a very extreme scenario, but it just goes to show that this lever is a very powerful lever. And ultimately, it's the only lever you actually need. And the only reason we're exploring other options is because it's kind of an awkward lever to have. Generally speaking, this hasn't polled well with the community. This idea of having Bitcoin slowly degrading in value as you keep it there. I mean, generally speaking, this is not dissimilar to account fees that you might pay or what have you.
I was just going to say, like, to me, like an AUM-based fee makes the most sense, actually, because it's sort of the kind of the incentives are so clearly like aligned that, the longer you use it, the more you pay. That I mean, it kind of, to me, it does make sense. I can't kind of imagine the actual like implementation of it, but yeah.
Yeah, and I think it's not that anyone doesn't think it makes sense. It's just it would be quite a unique asset in that sense with regard to any other crypto asset doesn't behave this way.
Because then would that mean that over time, kind of the one Ren BTC would become equivalent to like 0.995 BTC, essentially? Or
it's kind of, it'd be like a C token, but like reverse. So C tokens slowly become worth more of their underlying token, and an R token would slowly become worth less of its underlying token.
Got it. Okay. And I guess, there is definitely like the kind of third, or I guess fourth option on solving the bonded sort of pickle by pumping the token price, right?
I mean, I think it doesn't really work like that because ultimately,
that was not a serious
ultimately what it comes down to is about APY that you get for participating in powering the network. One of the cool things about a stability fee in this sense is that let's say you had a 5% stability fee, and generally speaking, people were comfortable with a 5% APY because it's essentially zero risk for the nodes. Now, if you had that and you're earning it in hard crypto, not in governance tokens. So let's say you're happy with a 5% APY. Most of our nodes today seem to be happy with that. Then if the stability fee was set at a hard 5%, then any amount of value that you would store in RenVM would automatically be accounted for with bond. If you had $1 billion, but you're getting 5% per annum on it, and people were happy with 5% per annum, then there'd be $1 billion of Ren locked up. Now, whether that meant there was one node whose bond was worth $1 billion, or whether there was $1 billion nodes where each of their bonds was worth one, is not actually relevant to the security of the network. All that's relevant is that the value bonded is correlates to the value locked in some way. So whether that means more tokens that are worth less or less tokens that are worth more, RenVM is kind of agnostic to the outcome.
Okay. So I want to move on to to another kind of when we talk about like the future of Ren, and another a feature that I remember I was super excited about. One of the first times I heard about Ren is kind of was the confirmation as a service. That I thought that it's such a kind of like a incredibly clever sort of like design approach to sort of to solving, you know, blockchains kind of native like issues or sort of, you know, peculiarities. So and I guess like till this date there hasn't been there hasn't been too much updates or like news around this feature. I just wanted to kind of understand so I guess question would be, what is confirmation as a service, and is there any sort of there been any kind of progress on it, or is it still in the plans?
So confirmation as a service is essentially a feature where someone who already has Ren BTC on Ethereum sees that you're in the process of confirming your BTC in order to get Ren BTC, and essentially gives you a temporary loan. So RenVM waits for 6 confirmations on Bitcoin, which can take up to an hour, or usually takes around an hour on average, can sometimes take more. So during this period, essentially someone else can give you an hour-long loan of Ren BTC that they already have. And they might do this in exchange for a small percentage of the Ren BTC that's actually getting minted at the end of the day. And this allows you to do some interesting things, like you can lock in a price on a DEX if you wanted to. So if you said, you know, Bitcoin is currently worth 13,000 DAI on Uniswap, and you want to lock that price in, you don't want to, you know, be exposed to an hour's worth of price change. You can send your assets over, and while they're confirming and going through the whole RenVM process, someone who already has Ren BTC makes the trade for you, gets the DAI, and gives you the DAI. And then when the BTC eventually clears, they get that as sort of a repayment of the loan. This can work in any way that you like. So it might be reputation based, it might be amount based, could be anything. Could even be KYC based if someone wanted to do that. There actually is an implementation of zero confirmation live right now. So there's a team that's independent of the Ren team that set something up called Zero Confirmation, which does this temporary, does this temporary loaning capability already. So you can interact with, I think they've hooked into Uniswap v2. I think they only support DAI at the moment, but you can do exactly that process that I just explained there. You can sort of send your Bitcoin, and once they see it in the mempool, they execute the trade for you, and then they keep the DAI in holding. So they keep it there. So you've locked in the price, but you haven't actually received the DAI yet, and you don't receive the DAI until until the Bitcoin actually comes through, and that allows them to keep this process kind of trustless. And so worst case scenario, they liquidate you if they don't see your Bitcoin within 3 hours, and they take the DAI and they say, okay, well, whatever, at least we have the DAI. And in exchange for that risk that they're taking on, they essentially charge you a small overhead. They also provide gas as a service, which is really cool. So in addition to providing confirmation as a service, they also pay the gas fees for you. So as a Bitcoin holder, if you don't have ETH or anything like that, you've never interacted with the ETH ecosystem before, you can still do this without having to go and get ETH first. And they'll go through that process. They'll pay for all the gas fees for you. They'll take those gas fees from your Bitcoin and then also give you a little bit of ETH left over so that you can continue and go hook into the ecosystem. And I think that's a great on-ramp for people who hold non-ETH currencies and want to move to holding ETH.
Absolutely. I mean, this is something that I think like kind of, you know, a lot of the popular sort of like smart wallets could really gain from having such a thing. Because I mean, even myself, I find myself, you know, stuck with, you know, just Tether and no ETH in a wallet, and then you kind of have to do this like weird, you know, lap around the house before you can, you know, kind of get in.
You kind of have to go through a centralized exchange these days. That's still the best UX that I've found to get in from something.
And so do I understand correctly that this that both the like confirmation as a service and gas as a service is not something that's kind of in the immediate roadmap for Ren?
So Ren doesn't. The idea is that we don't want to include that in the protocol itself. The way that RenVM has been built is that anyone can build these services in whatever way they like.
Okay.
That's already possible today. We have examples of it in our website, and as I mentioned, there's the Zero Confirmation team, which is put together an implementation of this that's live today.
Okay, awesome. So actually my next kind of question would have been sort of a bit like pretty open-ended, but that sort of RenVM's like future capabilities that around, like, you know, how far is in your view is RenVM from being, you know, from projects being able to, you know, build directly on top of Ren's blockchain? Because essentially what RenVM kind of is, it's a standalone blockchain, right? And like which kind of which applications would be the most sort of obvious to you, or what's really missing from the ecosystem today?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think I think we wouldn't see it until 2021 at the earliest, the ability to build directly onto RenVM. Even that, I think, is probably very ambitious. But I'm really excited for that capability, because building it does make sense, but it typically only makes sense in the context, the only applications we've thought of really make sense in the context of having lots of chains available, not just Bitcoin and Ethereum and Zcash and Bitcoin Cash, but having Bitcoin, Zcash, Doge, Digibyte available on Polkadot, ETH, and Binance, Filecoin as well, you know, just like a whole ecosystem of chains that are now connected. Then you can build an application that sits on RenVM that interacts with all of these simultaneously. One of the applications I'm most interested in is essentially something like Curve, so a stable pool where you can move between different representations of an asset on different chains. So you could imagine that you could put in USDC on Ethereum and get out BUSD on Binance without having to move the USDC to Binance and do it there first. So today, if you wanted to have a system like that, you would either have to interact with, you'd either have to have a Ren representation of BUSD on Curve, where you can put it into a pool and do what you want with it, or have the Curve application exist on Binance Smart Chain and have, you know, a representation of Ren USDC there. Instead, you don't have any Ren USD or Ren BUSD anywhere, and you have the application living on RenVM itself. And so you can deposit liquidity on Ethereum and withdraw liquidity from somewhere else, or deposit liquidity somewhere else and withdraw it on Ethereum without having to go through this minting and burning process. It's all implicit, if you will. I'm excited for those kind of applications to start being possible, but it's at least a year away.
So it would kind of be like a natively cross-chain Curve then, which doesn't actually touch any of the pegged assets, but using RenVM, I'm able to kind of go from, like, for example, like BUSD to or like a Binance USD to like USDC on Ethereum. Do you understand correctly?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So it's essentially like, you can imagine it as almost like half doing the process, where you lock up, let's say, USDC on Ethereum, and then instead of minting Ren USD somewhere else, you just keep it inside RenVM, and it just stays there. And then likewise, someone else locks up BUSD on Binance Smart Chain into RenVM, and instead of minting it somewhere else, they just leave it there. And now you've got this kind of pool that is under the custody of RenVM's decentralized MPC network. And at any point, you can send in some assets on one chain and ask for a different asset on a different chain. So it's kind of this idea of saying, at the moment, you put in, let's say, Bitcoin to RenVM and you get out Bitcoin on another chain. But imagine being able to put in Bitcoin on RenVM and get out any other asset on any other chain. It could be a stable asset that's maybe it's WBTC or SBTC, so it could be the same asset, but just different representation of it, or it could be a completely different asset. And I think when we do have the capability for people to build whatever applications they want, I think we will see applications like this built. because it's just such a natural use case.
Right. Well, I'll make sure to write the question down and ask you in a year. Okay,
in a year, I'll tell you it's a year away.
And so, I mean, we're sort of close to running out of time here. I know you're super busy. I just wanted to kind of get your take on this sort of, so we started talking about the kind of the craziness of DeFi summer, but I wanted to kind of get your take on how, because like in my view, like one thing that I've noticed is what this like DeFi summer did was that, yeah, there was a lot of kind of, exuberance and craziness, and people got, a lot of people got very rich, others got, got burnt a lot. But throughout this, it seems that it really brought DeFi sort of like here to stay. That the sort of that there's still like there's sort of so much kind of action now happening in DeFi. Do you kind of do you feel the same way? Obviously, being more active in the DeFi space, do you see that there's been this kind of explosion of kind of developer activity and like genuine interest?
There has, yeah. I would say all of the people that I know that have been thinking about the DeFi space since it first kind of became an idea like 2 years ago have been very deeply and genuinely interested in it. And there've been a lot of people that have been building in this space for a long time. And I think, if nothing else, the most recent hype kind of just unified pretty much every application that exists on Ethereum right now and said, oh, this is DeFi. And I think it's always been the case. It's always been DeFi, always has been. But now we've just figured out that that's the case. And I think begun to acknowledge that right now the killer use case for anything on Ethereum is either replicating existing financial technology and infrastructure in a way that is now permissionless and trustless and composable with everybody else, or creating fundamentally new financial infrastructure that is actually impossible to build anywhere else. The latter half is what I'm more excited for. And I think the most recent hype proved, if beyond a doubt, that you can build things that you just can't build in traditional fintech, both because the technology just doesn't work like that in the traditional financial sector, and because there's not this level of open access. And I don't just mean for users, but for developers as well. That some anonymous Kirby can come along and build a platform and build a community around that platform and have that be an advanced or even primitive financial technology. It just has never been possible before, because as a developer, there's no way to tap into the complex fintech ecosystem without a huge suite of connections and deal flow and regulatory compliance.
Absolutely. And do you have any kind of examples of these sort of what comes to mind when you speak about these kind of like completely novel use cases?
Yeah, one of the things that I'm really excited for, which I know is coming soon, is a project called KeepItDAO, which is basically a way to force the coordination of liquidators and arbitrageurs to cooperate and capture liquidity everywhere and pool it and share it in a trustless way. You just can't do that in the fintech space. There's not actually a clean notion of like liquidation is not this open and composable technique that can be done that works across any platform, because it can't be enshrined into a unified contract platform like Ethereum. But also, the reason why liquidations work in the first place is that you can do things in a single atomic move. So for example, you can take a loan from a liquidity pool, liquidate someone's position, rebalance the position that you've acquired using something like Uniswap, return the original loan back to the person you borrowed from, and then keep the profit. And you can do that in a single transaction in such a way that the lender can guarantee they're going to get their money back, and in such a way that you don't need to provide any collateral up front. So it's just some kid in his computer and $0 of collateral and maybe $100 of ETH can liquidate a $100 million position and walk away with $5 million in profit. That's not possible today in the traditional fintech space, but it is possible today on Ethereum.
Yeah, super exciting.
It's cool stuff.
I guess, but how do you see, one thing I find myself kind of wondering is, how do you see the sort of, obviously, the big kind of word is like mass adoption, right? That we're all kind of, endlessly dreaming about and can't wait for. how do you see that kind of playing out in DeFi? Do you think is there going to be sort of, are we talking about that essentially this new decentralized economy is going to be solely built on DeFi, or is there actually like a reason for the current kind of like traditional finance to more and more start sort of like dabbling around and touching DeFi?
Yeah, I think we'll see both. So on one hand, I don't think there's going to be this magical moment where adoption happens. Even now, if you just look back 5 years, or if you want an even more extreme view, 10 years, it's hard to pick out an individual moment where we said suddenly crypto was popular. Sure, certainly a lot of publicity came around, the huge pump at the end of 2017. But was that the moment? Probably not, right? There's not going to be a moment. We're just going to kind of, it's like getting taller. One day you look back at the little marks that you leave on your wall and you're just like, holy shit, I've grown like a literal meter, but I never noticed, right? Because it's slow and it takes time. On the other hand, we're seeing adoptions from platforms like PayPal. I think it's only a matter of time before we see these user products in the traditional fintech space adopting crypto in some form. And then I think eventually that's the first step. And then the next step is saying, well, how do we let our users put that crypto to use and actually use it? And I do believe that some of these platforms will begin doing that by engaging with these underlying liquidity pools that we've already set about creating. The nice thing is that you basically create this open and permissionless liquidity pool, and then you'll probably get a whole bunch of individual products and platforms building on top of these and providing whatever it is that the user needs, whether that's a nice user experience, whether that's good onboarding through fiat and offboarding through fiat, whether that's integrations into the Visa network or whatever it happens to be. There will always be a space for these centralized custodians, even if that space is just trust, right? Whereas, a lot of my friends who aren't in this space, they don't trust themselves to know what to do, but they trust PayPal. So it's kind of trust goes in the opposite way. And I think there are people like you and me and other people who are crypto native right now that we trust ourselves more than we trust these other platforms, or as much as we would trust these other platforms. So we're happy to be self-sovereign. So I think there'll always be a place for these centralized custodians, because there's definitely a ton of people out there who don't want to be responsible for that stuff.
Absolutely. I mean, technically, I run a centralized exchange, so I kind of I'm sort of like biased here on this conversation, but okay. But I guess my very last question to you would be that what does Ren need help with the most in the sort of in the next couple months?
Wow, that's a good question. Get involved.
Or is it just heads down and working?
It is heads down and working. I think getting involved in the community and helping us establish best practices around governance. The reason we haven't moved to a token voting model yet is because we want to make sure that the model that we're going to formalize is a model that's sustainable. The best way to know that is getting people involved in it. So come get to know the Ren VM system. If you're worried about a particular aspect of its design, bring that up in an RFC and help us and the broader community find a way to solve that problem, or mitigate it to the best of technology's capabilities. I think that's at the stage where we're at, where we're now really wanting to start getting contributions from the community to the protocol itself. And of course, if you're not at that level, technically speaking, but you still want to help the project, pick up some Ren BTC, put it to use. Pick up some fill when it's available, turn it into Ren BTC, turn it into Ren fill, put that to use. Use the platform, because that helps us understand how it's getting used and how the incentives that we've designed are actually playing out in practice.
Sounds good. Let's do it. All right. Thank you so much for your time, Loong, once again from Ren Protocol, and I wish you all the luck until the end of the year.
Thanks.